The dinner that should have represented luxury and power turned into a cruel spectacle of humiliation. She, her simple dress already marked by haste and nervousness, knelt before the gleaming table, balancing the tray with trembling hands. The red-robed guest's gaze, cold and calculated, conveyed not only arrogance, but also a sense of silent victory over the one who had once occupied that place with dignity. He, standing with his arms crossed, watched as if it were the most natural of scenes, convinced that authority was asserted not only in contracts, but in acts capable of crushing the self-esteem of those who could not defend themselves. The heavy silence of the room was broken only by the clink of cutlery and the pent-up sound of suffocated breathing, but there were eyes that captured every detail without fully comprehending the weight of what was happening. In the corner of the room, the young son watched the scene with a mixture of confusion and pain. The toy slipped from his hands, ignored, while his tearful eyes fixed on the maternal figure on the floor. That gesture, so cruelly imposed, pierced the child's heart like a silent wound that would never be forgotten. Suddenly, his cry cut through the room with unexpected force. It wasn't just a childish cry, but a cry of purity against the injustice he was witnessing. The man who so cherished the image of strength and control felt the impact of this sound as if it were a blow, but still maintained a rigid expression, unable to admit the depth of the scar he had just inflicted on his own son. At that moment, a question hung like an invisible sentence over everyone present. When the search for power surpasses the limits of the heart, who really pays the price of choices? If this scene moved you, subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so that more people can feel the power of this story. Before the humiliation took shape that night in Gangnam, the life of Yoon Da-hye was marked by simplicity, dedication, and a quiet strength that few recognized. Born into a humble family in the port city of Busan, grew up among narrow streets, popular markets, and the constant smell of sea air that wafted through the neighborhood. His father, a small fishmonger, taught him from an early age the value of honesty, while his mother showed him that true wealth lay in caring for those we love. Da-hye was never a woman with great personal ambitions. Her dreams were modest: to graduate in law, help the local community, and above all, build a solid family, something she had always imagined to be her greatest treasure. When she met Han Jun-ho, still a university student in Seoul, believed she had found the ideal partner to share this life of dedication. He came from a different, more affluent background, but seemed enchanted by her generosity and sweetness. In the early years of their marriage, they lived in a small apartment in Mapo, where every achievement, no matter how small, was celebrated as if it were the beginning of a promising future. It was during this period that he was born Han Ji-hoo, the son who brightened her days. Da-hye spent hours preparing simple meals, singing lullabies, and filling the home with an atmosphere of unconditional love. As Jun-ho began his journey into the corporate world, she was the foundation that supported every step forward, organizing finances, reviewing reports when he was late for work, and enduring the loneliness of long nights when her husband didn't come home. Her closest friends said she was the definition of fidelity and devotion. She never complained, even when the weight of silence consumed her. She never demanded anything more than presence and affection, believing that love and loyalty would be enough to keep her marriage intact. But the world around her began to change, and with it, Jun-ho's view of the woman he had chosen to share his life with. Da-hye, in her simplicity, continued to believe that a person's value lay in their essence, not their appearance or social status. Even when she began accompanying her husband to some business events, she maintained a low profile, always preferring to observe rather than show off. To many, she seemed out of place in that ostentatious world, but she never let herself be shaped by other people's expectations. It was in this contrast between Da-hye's sweetness and Jun-ho's growing ambition that the chasm began to open. While she remained true to her roots, he distanced himself further and further from what they had built together. And it was in this emotional gap that the shadow of another woman, Choi Min-seo, would begin to insinuate itself into their lives. What began as a small distance would soon turn into an insurmountable abyss, fueled by Jun-ho's ego and Min-seo's seductive presence, which would awaken in him a pride capable of corroding even the most solid of homes. The path of Han Jun-ho's journey into the business world began with effort and discipline, but it soon turned into a frantic race for power and recognition. Taking over the helm of a technology company in Seoul, he went from a promising young man to one of the most talked-about names in the market. Magazines featured his image on sophisticated covers, interviews highlighted his leadership skills, and foreign investors were impressed by his calculated coolness. With each achievement, he moved further away from the simple life he had shared with Da-hye. At first, she proudly watched her husband's victories. She applauded each signed contract, prepared special meals to celebrate his new projects, and believed that his success was, in some way, also the result of her silent support. But for Jun-ho, the spotlight became addictive. The higher he rose, the more ashamed he felt of his own roots, and especially of his wife, who didn't conform to the standard of sophistication demanded by his new social circle. At the lavish parties in Gangnam, Da-hye remained discreet, often ignored by the executives' wives who flaunted expensive jewelry and talked about international travel. Jun-ho, instead of defending her, would cower in silence or look away, as if she were an uncomfortable reminder of a life he wanted to leave behind. He no longer saw her as the partner who had shared his difficult days with him, but rather as a presence that, in his eyes, didn't fit the portrait of success he wanted to project. It was in this context that it emerged Choi Min-seo, an ambitious young woman who frequented the same business events. Intelligent, astute, and always dressed with calculated elegance, she quickly recognized the CEO's vulnerability, his desire for boundless admiration and recognition. Min-seo knew how to use words that fed his ego, as if each compliment were a gold coin deposited in his pride. In front of her, Jun-ho felt not only a respected businessman, but a desired and needed man. The contrast between Da-hye and Min-seo became stark, while his wife remained true to her values and simple life. Min-seo offered the radiance and admiration Jun-ho believed he deserved. Little by little, he began to neglect home-cooked dinners, quiet conversations with his son, and even family weekends. Each absence was justified by work commitments, but in reality, hours were spent secretly meeting with his mistress. The arrogance became increasingly evident. In the company hallways, Jun-ho walked with a haughty posture, almost dismissive of the older employees. At home, his gestures toward Da-hye became cold, dry, and even hostile. The small criticisms became constant, as if any action on her part were cause for shame. The man who had once sworn eternal love was now a stranger, his eyes filled with arrogance and contempt. It was at this point that the distance between husband and wife ceased to be merely emotional and became public. The world around them began to notice Jun-ho's coldness toward Da-hye, and the increasingly present lover made no attempt to hide her influence. But what seemed like a silent dismissal would soon turn into a cruel spectacle. When the contempt was no longer veiled and became an open humiliation in front of everyone, the weight of shame would fall devastatingly on Da-hye. The Gangnam dinner, which was supposed to be a business meeting marked by celebrations and contracts, was recorded as the night when Yoon Da-hye was reduced to an object of scorn. The guests were taking their places around the long table, illuminated by crystal chandeliers, when Jun-ho, in a firm and measured voice, gave the order that would forever change the way everyone saw her. "Pour the wine, Da-hye," he said without a trace of hesitation. The words echoed in the room, and for a moment the entire room seemed suspended in time. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, but the presence of their gazes pressed on her. Each glance was an invisible knife reminding her that here she was seen not as a wife, but as a disposable figure. With trembling hands, he picked up the bottle and began to walk around the table. To lover Choi Min-seo took advantage of every second to enhance the spectacle. With a smile on the corner of his mouth, he leaned toward the investors and commented, as if speaking of something trivial, "It's admirable to see how the CEO values discipline in all aspects of life." The venom-laced comment drew suppressed laughter, but it was enough for Da-hye to feel the weight of humiliation increase. She continued, pouring glass after glass, keeping her eyes downcast to hide the pain that threatened to overflow. Suddenly, Min-seo deliberately dropped a few drops of wine on the white tablecloth, creating a small red stain that contrasted with the otherwise perfect setting. Feigning surprise, she raised her glass and said in a sweet but mocking tone, "Oh, how careless. Could you clean it for me, Da-hye?" Silence fell over the room again. The request wasn't innocent. It was a command disguised as politeness. Da-hye, swallowing her pride, knelt before her lover, holding a napkin to clean the tablecloth. Her knees touched the cold marble, and in that instant, the weight of the scene became unbearable. It was then that when she looked up, she was met with the innocent gaze of her son, Han Ji-hoo, who was watching hidden near the door. The boy, only 6 years old, had tears streaming down his cheeks. Seeing his mother kneeling, holding the cloth like a servant, he couldn't contain his grief. His voice breaking, he cried out, "Oma, why are you on the floor? Get up, please!" The child's scream cut through the air and pierced the hearts of everyone present. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others avoided the scene, but no one could remain indifferent. Da-hye tried to smile at her son as if she could erase what he had just witnessed, but her teary eyes betrayed her. Jun-ho, angered by the shattering of the perfect image he'd tried to maintain, ordered the boy to be taken to another room. His cold voice sounded more like a sentence than a request. "Get him out of here." The boy was dragged away in tears, still calling for his mother, his every word echoing like a cruel reminder of what had just happened. Da-hye remained kneeling, not out of submission, but because her legs no longer had the strength to support her. In that moment, she realized that the greatest pain was not being humiliated in front of strangers, but in front of her own son. When he finally stood up, the hall was no longer just a business space. It had become the stage for the silent ruin of a marriage. The woman who had once sustained her husband's dreams was now displayed like a broken trophy, and everyone there knew something had changed forever. And if Da-hye lost more than she could have imagined that night, what came next would be even more devastating. For Jun-ho, in his arrogance, would not be content with mere humiliation. He was preparing the final blow that would leave her with nothing but her own dignity. The morning after dinner in Gangnam, silence hung heavy in the mansion. The servants avoided meeting each other's eyes, Yoon Da-hye, as if the shame of the previous night had spread through the hallways, permeating every corner. She remained in the living room, still stunned, trying to recover from her son's desperate gaze, when she heard firm footsteps echoing on the marble floor. It was Han Jun-ho, impeccably dressed, ready for another day of business, but with the cold expression of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. Without beating around the bush, he dropped a stack of papers onto the table. They were the divorce papers. His voice, as sharp as a blade, echoed emotionlessly. "Sign. Our marriage ends here." Da-hye felt the ground give way beneath her feet. For a moment, she thought it might just be another empty threat, born of the previous night's anger. But as she looked into Jun-ho's eyes, she realized there was no room for appeal. This wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was a cold, pre-planned sentence. He had already prepared everything. Her assets would be transferred to her name, her credit cards would be blocked, and she would receive only a paltry sum to survive. Breathing quickly, she tried to argue, not for herself, but for her son. And Ji-hoo? He needs a home. He needs stability. Jun-ho didn't even look up from his papers. He simply said, in an impersonal tone, "He will have what he needs. I will provide it, but not with me. You no longer fit into the life I am building." The words were like knives stabbing Da-hye's heart. Silently, she swallowed her tears and held the papers with trembling hands. In that instant, the memory of the previous night came back to her. Kneeling before her lover, watched by her son, she realized that for Jun-ho, that scene hadn't been excessive cruelty, but a necessary step toward breaking her once and for all, toward leaving her so small that she wouldn't have the strength to resist abandonment. With no time to think, she packed some clothes into a small suitcase and held her son's hand, who watched with red eyes from crying. Ji-hoo didn't understand the adult reasons behind the separation, but she felt the pain of losing the home where she grew up and the father who, though distant, was always there. As she walked out the front door, Da-hye didn't look back. The cold Seoul wind bit her face, but nothing compared to the chill that now resided in her chest. Everything had been taken from her, her home, her security, her comfortable life. But deep down, something remained intact. Her dignity. No matter how humiliated she had been, she refused to allow her essence to be destroyed. However, life far from luxury would not be easy. What awaited her was a period of solitude, sleepless nights, and the painful struggle for survival. And yet, it was in this scenario of decline that Da-hye would discover the silent strength that would change the course of her life. The change was abrupt and cruel. Leaving the mansion in Gangnam to live in a small apartment in Incheonit was like crossing a chasm between two worlds. The space was cramped, the furniture worn, and the peeling walls revealed how much life had changed in a matter of days. Yoon Da-hye, who previously coordinated dinners for executives and organized the routine in a house full of employees, now shared a room with his son, improvising so that he wouldn't feel the difference so much. The first few nights were the hardest. Ji-hoo, lying on a narrow mattress, wept silently, asking when they could go home. Da-hye held him tightly, holding back her own tears so as not to add to the boy's pain. She repeated words of comfort, promising they would be okay, even though deep down she wasn't sure how to rebuild their lives. During the day, she sought any job opportunity. She took shifts at a local cafe, cleaning tables and serving hurried customers. She often left, with her hands red from scrubbing the floor, but with a slightly lighter heart for being able to provide her son with dinner. There were nights when, exhausted, she would fall asleep at the table, still in her uniform, but forced herself to get up before Ji-hoo noticed her weakness. Loneliness was a constant enemy. Accustomed to being ignored by her husband, she now faced the weight of total abandonment. The silence of the small apartment was broken only by the sound of rain against the windows, or the distant sound of passing trains. At times, she thought about everything she had lost, but she didn't allow self-pity to consume her. She knew she had to stay strong, even if the world around her insisted on tearing her down. Da-hye found strength in small gestures, her son's shy smile as he received a snack she'd saved up to buy, the flowers he brought home from school, and the notes written with phrases like, "Oma, you are strong." These small reminders were the fuel that kept her going when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. With each passing day, it became clear that, even broken, she carried within her a silent strength that was beginning to blossom. It wasn't yet time for a turning point, but the pain was shaping a new character, hardening what had previously been only gentleness and patience. The world had knocked her to the ground, but from there, little by little, she would learn to rise with steps firmer than ever before, and it would be precisely in the silence of the early morning hours, when Ji-hoo was already asleep and the world seemed to have forgotten her, that Da-hye would begin to secretly write the most surprising chapter of her life. The early mornings in Incheon have become a secret refuge for Yoon Da-hye, while her son, exhausted from classes and the sudden changes, fell asleep on his simple mattress. She lay awake, surrounded by books and notebooks spread out on the small kitchen table. The dim light from the lamp reflected off the yellowed pages of old notes, remnants of a dream she'd abandoned in the past, the law school she'd put aside to support Jun-ho's career. With each revised page, she felt a strength she had forgotten was reborn within her. The first few hours were difficult. Her tired mind resisted, and the words seemed to jumble before her eyes. But Da-hye persisted, remembering every sacrifice, every humiliation, and transforming that pain into fuel. She studied with silent determination, telling no one, as if that secret were the only flame that could light her way back. At the cafe where she worked during the day, customers saw her simply as a dedicated employee, politely serving with a discreet smile. But no one imagined that behind that seemingly simple figure lurked a woman silently plotting her own resurrection. Between espresso orders and loaded trays, Da-hye mentally reviewed articles, memorized legal passages, and planned strategies for upcoming exams. Ji-hoo, even though he was young, noticed something different about his mother. Some mornings when he woke, he would find her still on the table, asleep among books, a pen still clutched between her fingers. He would cover her with a light blanket without waking her, as if to protect the secret struggle he didn't fully understand, but respected with the heart of a child who had already learned the weight of silence. Time passed, and each day added a new layer of strength to Da-hye's spirit. She knew the road would be long and arduous, but she also knew she could no longer live in the shadows of what she had lost. For the first time, her eyes shone again with a purpose that wasn't tied to her husband or her marriage, but to herself and her son's future. Meanwhile, in Seoul, the world of Han Jun-ho pursued his course of ambition and power. He believed Da-hye had disappeared into mediocrity, that she would never again pose any threat to his impeccable image. But far from the spotlight and luxury, a quiet revolution was taking place, and every page Da-hye turned was a promise that fate would yet reserve an inevitable reunion for her. This invisible preparation, carried out on cold, lonely nights, was the seed of a transformation no one expected. The woman who had been humiliated in front of everyone was, step by step, secretly building the foundation of a future where she would no longer be the shadow of an arrogant man, but the protagonist of her own story. But even as she quietly forged her life, the empire Jun-ho had built began to show cracks. Small flaws, betrayals, and mistakes piled up, foreshadowing that soon the arrogance that had sustained him would be the very weight that dragged him down. While Yoon Da-hye burned the dawns in Incheon, planting the seeds of his transformation in Seoul, the universe of Han Jun-ho was beginning to show its first cracks. The impeccable image of a visionary CEO he had so zealously cultivated no longer seemed so solid. The market, which had previously applauded him, now murmured doubts. Small contracts were broken without explanation, investors began postponing meetings, and rumors of mismanagement echoed in the company's own corridors. Jun-ho, accustomed to being the center of attention, reacted with irritation. Every criticism struck him as a personal offense. He gathered his team for long meetings that ended in shouting and slammed doors, as if the sheer volume of his voice could drown out the signs of a crisis. But the truth was clear. His arrogance had blinded his vision, and decisions made more by vanity than reason were beginning to take their toll. The fall didn't just come from numbers or reports. Inside the house itself, the lover Choi Min-seo, she no longer showed the same devotion. In the early days, she was proud to be paraded alongside the powerful CEO, but as the months passed, party invitations became rarer, and the luster of the Junho name was no longer enough to sustain her. Min-seo began to seek out other circles, surrounded by even wealthier and more influential people, leaving her partner alone in his silent crises. It was on a particularly difficult night that Min-seo's mask slipped. An important event had been scheduled, but she didn't show up with him. Instead, photos circulated on social media showing her smiling in another salon, accompanied by a foreign investor. Junho, seeing the images, felt for the first time the weight of betrayal. The man who prided himself on subjugating others now experienced the bitter taste of being discarded. Loneliness began to haunt him. He tried to get closer to his son, Han Ji-hoo, perhaps hoping to regain some emotional connection. But the child already carried the scene of the Gangnam dinner in his memory. Upon seeing his father, he responded coldly, calling him only him, avoiding even the word appa casually. For Junho, that estrangement was more painful than any financial crisis, as it was a vivid reminder that he had lost not only his wife's respect, but also his own son's love. As the days wore on, Junho discovered that power wasn't unbreakable. His arrogance, once his shield, now became a chain that bound him. The man who had viewed Da-hye as a burden now began to feel the weight of his choices crushing down on his own shoulders. The empire that seemed untouchable was about to crumble, and he, for the first time, experienced the fragility of someone who doesn't control their own destiny. His lover abandoned him, his partners betrayed him, the market despised him, and his son rejected him. For the first time, Han Junho saw in the mirror not the reflection of a victor, but of a man on the brink of collapse. And it would be precisely in this abyss, at the moment he began to lose everything, that an unexpected figure would appear before him, no longer kneeling, no longer humiliated, but standing tall with a dignity that would remind everyone who truly carried the strength of this story. The Seoul courthouse was packed that grey morning. Journalists, lawyers, and onlookers crowded the hallways, eager to follow the case involving one of the most talked-about names in the corporate world, Han Junho, accused of fraud, corruption, and abuse of power. For many, it heralded the end of an era. For others, it was just another predictable chapter in the downfall of a man who believed he was above everything and everyone. Junho arrived under escort, but he still tried to maintain his haughty bearing. His tailored suit, expensive watch, and firm gait were desperate attempts to maintain the aura of grandeur that no longer convinced anyone. His eyes, however, betrayed his weariness, and the deep circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. The murmurs intensified when the courtroom's main door opened and the judge overseeing the case entered the room. The shock was immediate, as if time had stopped for a moment. Yoon Da-hye, she walked with firm steps, dressed in a toga that reflected not only authority, but also a transformation of a lifetime. The same body that had once knelt before her lover now stood with unshakable serenity, and the eyes that had once brimmed with tears now conveyed firmness and clarity. The journalists looked at each other, murmuring in surprise. "It's her, the wife he humiliated." Junho felt his blood run cold. The man who had laughed at her simplicity now had to face the woman who had silently rebuilt her life to a position he had never imagined. There were no words to describe the weight of that reunion. Da-hye, for her part, didn't seek revenge. There was no arrogance in her posture, no rancor on her face. Her presence was serene, almost imperturbable. For her, being there wasn't about revenge. but about justice. The dignity that had been stripped from her had been restored, not by the hands of fate, but by her own determination. As the trial unfolded, her every word carried not only the force of the law, but also the memory of all she had endured. The hall, which had once echoed with derisive laughter, now bowed before the authority of this woman no one dared despise anymore. Jun-ho, before her, was no longer the unbeatable CEO, but a broken man, swallowed by his own arrogance. Every time he looked at her, he saw not only the judge who judged him, but also the wife he had once wasted, the mother who had given her son an example of courage, and the woman who had chosen to rise again when everyone thought she was defeated. The silence that fell across the room wasn't one of embarrassment, but of respect. Everyone understood they were witnessing more than just a common trial. They were witnessing the culmination of a story that had begun in humiliation, but was now turning into triumph. But if the courtroom was the stage for Da-hye's glorious reappearance, it would be in a much more intimate moment that Jun-ho's emotional ruin would reach its peak. For the man who had once forced her to her knees would soon be the one to fall to his knees, begging for something he could no longer regain. The days of trial became long and suffocating, for Han Jun-ho's testimony revealed dark details of his administration. Each document presented chipped away at the image he was trying to maintain. But no blow was as devastating as the firm silence of Yoon Da-hye, who, at the head of the court, never raised his voice, never allowed himself to be shaken. His serenity was like a cruel mirror, showing him everything he had lost. That morning, as Jun-ho left the hearing, he found himself face to face with his son. Han Ji-hoo, now a teenager, stood beside his mother. The young man couldn't hide the pride in his eyes as he looked at Da-hye. When reporters approached, trying to extract a statement, Ji-hoo held his mother's hand and replied firmly, "My mother is my pride. I don't need anything else." The phrase echoed like a sentence. Jun-ho felt the ground give way beneath his feet. The son who had once called out to him in tears now stood before everyone, to declare that the true figure of respect in his life was his mother. No public humiliation could be more painful than losing one's own son's heart. That night, unable to bear the weight of emptiness, Jun-ho went to the small house where Da-hye lived with Ji-hoo. There were no more security guards, no more luxury cars, just him, alone, with poorly chosen flowers in his hand and teary eyes. He rang the doorbell, hesitant, like a man about to beg for his life. Da-hye opened the door. She was dressed simply, as she had always liked, but she had an imposing presence about her, the fruit of the strength she had gained with each step of the journey. The silence between them lasted for a few seconds that seemed eternal. Then Jun-ho, unable to maintain his facade, fell to his knees before her. "Forgive me, Da-hye. I was a fool. I destroyed everything we had. I am nothing without you." Tears streamed uncontrollably, staining the face of someone who had never allowed himself to show weakness. For the first time, he wasn't speaking as a CEO, but as a man stripped of titles, begging for something that no longer belonged to him. Ji-hoo, who watched the scene from the bedroom doorway, felt a mixture of pain and indignation. Seeing his father on his knees seemed like the poetic justice he'd been waiting for years, but at the same time, it was too late. Nothing could take back the years he'd watched his mother be humiliated. Da-hye looked at Jun-ho without anger, but also without compassion. Her voice was calm, firm, and each word seemed to carry the weight of her entire transformation. "What you destroyed cannot be rebuilt with tears. You are not on your knees before me, but before your own choices." The response didn't come as a scream. It didn't come as revenge. It was a reflection of the new woman she had become, someone who didn't need revenge to feel whole. The silence that followed was more devastating than any insult. Jun-ho remained kneeling, sobbing. Like a broken man, as Da-hye slowly walked away, never looking back. In that moment he realized he had lost not only his wife, but also the right to be a part of the life she had rebuilt. But the true sentence was yet to come, for after the tears, Da-hye's final decision would come, and it would be this silent gesture that would forever seal Han Jun-ho's fate. After that night, when Han Jun-hok knelt in tears, the silence grew even heavier between them. The man who had once demeaned her in front of everyone now begged for a second chance, but Yoon Da-hye, she knew there was no turning back. What had been lost was not just a marriage, but the trust, dignity, and innocence of a love she had sustained alone for years. The following days were marked by frustrated attempts at rapprochement. Jun-ho sent messages, appeared in court disguised as a spectator, left flowers at her door. But each gesture seemed small compared to the weight of the memories. Da-hye never forgot the nights she'd fallen, asleep alone waiting for him, the tears she'd shed silently, and above all, Ji-hoo's desperate look at dinner in Gangnam when he'd seen her on her knees. Nothing could erase that scar. One afternoon, Jun-ho managed to find her alone as he left the courthouse. The sky was cloudy and the cold wind seemed to herald the end of a cycle. He walked toward her, his eyes red, his voice choked, trying one last time. Da-hye, please, we can start over. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our child. She stared at him for long seconds. There was no anger in her eyes, but there was no tenderness either. What there was a painful clarity. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but firm, like a final sentence. You've already lost. Not by my hands, but by your choices. The love that existed died when you forced me to kneel before your lover. What's left of us is only silence. And it's this silence that will accompany you. Jun-ho tried to hold her hand, but she pulled away. Gently, without violence, only with the strength of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. That gesture was more devastating than any words. It was the final rejection, the point of no return, proof that she had not only survived the pain, but had also learned to live without him. Upon returning home, Da-hye found Ji-hoo waiting for her. The young man looked her in the eye and with a slight smile said, "Oma, I always knew you would choose what was right for us." In that moment, she realized that her choice hadn't been just for the past, but for the future. She'd decided not to cling to the ruins of a failed marriage, but to walk alongside her son toward a new life where dignity wouldn't be compromised. Jun-ho, on the other hand, stood on the sidewalk watching her walk away. Loneliness enveloped him like a shadow, and the lack of response became his greatest punishment. He discovered that sometimes silence is crueler than any words, and that contempt can be a heavier sentence than hatred. This was Da-hye's final choice. No revenge, no hate, no shouting. Just move on, leaving behind the man who, in his arrogance, had destroyed his own destiny. And so, with the decision made, all that remained was to see where the path would lead each of them. For life, relentless in its justice, was already setting the stage for the end, an outcome in which each would reap exactly what they had sown. The years passed, and time revealed the harvest of each choice. Once reduced to a shadow, she transformed each pain into a stepping stone to her ascension. In the Seoul court, she became a beacon of ethics and firmness, respected by her colleagues and admired even by those who didn't believe in her strength. She was no longer remembered as the CEO's ex-wife, but as a judge of integrity, whose voice carried the wisdom of someone who had experienced injustice firsthand. By her side, her son grew up confident and proud. A diligent teenager, he dedicated himself to his studies with the same determination he had learned to observe in his mother. He dreamed of becoming a diplomat, bringing to the world the example of resilience he had witnessed at home. For him, her every victory was also his own. Her every step, an inspiration to never bow down in the face of adversity. Meanwhile, his life went in the opposite direction. The man once celebrated as a business genius was now nothing more than a shadow. The company sank into debt, his partners abandoned him, and his lover vanished like smoke, leaving only the bitter memory of a love built on self-interest. Alone in his mansion, he stared down the silent hallways, hunched over bottles of liquor, pleading with an unresponsive void. The irony was cruel. He, who had demanded submission, now reaped only loneliness. She, on the other hand, didn't need to raise her voice or plot revenge. Her victory was built on her own reconstruction. He himself had built the ruin with his own hands. One peaceful autumn, walking beside her son, she felt peace in her heart. The past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined her life. Each reaped what they sowed. He, regret; she, dignity. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, like, share, and comment. Your voice keeps transformative stories alive.